The wind howled across the plains, carrying dust and the scent of rain that never quite came. In a small, broken house at the edge of a forgotten village, a woman lay curled on the mud floor, her cheek pressed against cold earth that had soaked up her tears and her blood for years. Her name was Lila, though no one in that place remembered it anymore. To her husband, she was simply a curse. To her neighbors, she was pity wrapped in silence. To herself, she was nothing but a mother of 3 daughters, and that, in her world, was her sin. The last blow had come hours ago, when the evening sun painted the walls orange and her youngest daughter, barely a year old, cried for milk. Her husband had returned home from the fields, reeking of sweat and fury, demanding to know why the gods had denied him a son yet again. "You bring shame to my blood," he had shouted, and the neighbors had heard, as they always did, but no one came. The house echoed with the thud of fists and the sound of hope breaking into pieces. When night fell, Lila's daughters, Rani, Mira, and Tara, crept from the corner where they had hidden, their small hands trembling as they wiped the blood from their mother's face. "Ma," whispered Mira, the middle child, "let's run away." Lila only smiled, the kind of smile that hurt more than any wound. "Where would we go, my heart?" she murmured. "The world is the same everywhere for women like us, but fate, as it often does, had other plans. At dawn, when the sky was bruised with the first light, a shadow fell across their door. It wasn't the shadow of her husband. He had already left for the fields, but that of a man whose presence filled the doorway like thunder. He was enormous, tall as a tree, shoulders broad enough to carry storms. His face was carved by sun and time, his beard the color of winter. He was known, across the land, as Elias Gray, the giant rancher, a man who owned half the valley and whose hands could gentle a wild horse as easily as they could crush a stone. No one knew much about him. Some said he'd once been a soldier. Others whispered he'd lost his wife to sickness and had never smiled since. But that morning, Elias wasn't there for business. He was there because he had heard something, the cries of a woman carried by the wind. Lila froze when she saw him. She clutched her daughters close, fear flooding her eyes. "Sir, please." "My husband," she began, but Elias raised a hand, quiet and steady. His eyes softened when they landed on the children. "You don't owe that man another word," he said in a voice that was deep and slow, like the earth itself was speaking. "I heard what he did. I heard enough." Lila shook her head, trembling. "He's my husband. I have nowhere else." The rancher stepped inside, his boots heavy on the floor. "Then come with me," he said simply. "You and your girls. There's room on my land for people who've suffered enough." For a long moment there was only silence, the kind that lives between fear and hope. Lila looked at the man before her, at his weathered hands and eyes that carried both kindness and sorrow. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not once. "I can't," she whispered finally. "He'll find us. He'll kill me." Elias knelt so he could meet her gaze. "He'll have to get through me first," he said, "and I don't bend easy." That was the moment something broke. Not inside her, but outside. The cage that had held her for years cracked open, just enough for light to slip in. She wanted to believe him, but belief was a dangerous thing. Still, when her daughters looked up at her with wide, pleading eyes, Lila knew that staying meant death, not only of the body, but of the spirit. She took a breath, slow and shaking, and said, "If I go, I take all of them." Elias nodded once. "All or nothing," he replied. They left before sunrise. Lila wrapped her youngest in an old shawl, gathered what little she owned, a few clothes, a small silver locket from her mother, and a handful of dried lentils, and stepped into the unknown. The rancher led them on foot through the quiet fields, the earth damp under their feet, the air heavy with mist. No one in the village saw them leave, or if they did, they said nothing. The world doesn't often notice when a broken woman disappears. By the time they reached Elias's land, the sun had risen high, bathing the valley in gold. His ranch spread across the horizon, endless fields of tall grass, horses grazing, wooden fences stretching into distance. For Lila's daughters, it was like stepping into another world. "Is this heaven, Ma?" asked Rani in a whisper. Lila almost said yes. At the ranch, Elias's workers stopped to stare. They had never seen him bring anyone home before. He gave them one look and that was enough. No questions were asked. He showed Lila a small cabin near the edge of the property, by a stream that ran clear and soft. "It's not much," he said, "but it's yours as long as you need it." Lila tried to thank him, but her voice cracked. Elias turned away before she could see the flicker of pain in his eyes. Pain he'd buried long ago when he'd lost the woman he loved. Days passed, then weeks. Lila learned to work the ranch, feeding the horses, milking the cows, tending to the garden. Her daughters laughed again, their feet chasing butterflies in the fields. For the first time, their laughter didn't sound afraid. Sometimes Elias would watch from afar, his heart tightening with something he couldn't name. She reminded him of someone, the strength behind her scars, the quiet fire in her eyes. But he kept his distance, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace she was rebuilding. One evening, as the sun melted into the hills, Lila found him mending a fence by the barn. "Why did you help us?" she asked. Elias looked up, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Because someone once helped me," he said, "and I didn't take it when I should have. I've lived with that regret ever since." He paused, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "You don't owe me thanks, Lila. Just live, that's enough." But peace never lasts forever. One night, the wind carried more than rain. It carried footsteps. A man staggered up the ranch road, drunk on fury and liquor. Lila's husband, his eyes were wild, his hands clutching a knife. "You think you can take what's mine?" he shouted, his voice slicing through the dark. The ranch hands rushed to stop him, but Elias stepped forward. The two men faced each other beneath the moonlight, one giant and calm as stone, the other small and burning with hate. "She's not yours to own," Elias said. "Go back before you lose more than your pride." But pride was all the man had left, and it was poison. He lunged, the knife flashed, but Elias was faster. In one move he disarmed him, sending the blade spinning into the dirt. "Enough," he growled. The man collapsed, sobbing, cursing, broken. Elias didn't strike him. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any blow. He ordered his men to send the man away, far from the ranch, and told them never to let him return. When it was over, Lila stood at the doorway, tears shining in her eyes. "You didn't have to protect me," she whispered. Elias looked at her, his voice low. "Yes, I did, because someday you'll learn to stand for yourself. But until then, I'll stand here." That night, as Lila watched the stars from her cabin, her daughters sleeping peacefully beside her, she felt something new. Not safety, not yet, but the beginning of it. A seed of hope buried deep in her chest. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time she wasn't afraid to find out. And far across the fields, Elias stood by the corral, his shadow long beneath the moon. He looked toward the cabin and whispered, "Come with me, not because you're weak, but because you're meant to rise." The days that followed the night of the confrontation were quieter than before, as if even the wind had agreed to keep its breath. Low, out of respect for what had happened, the ranch carried on. Horses galloped at dawn, workers shouted across the fields, and the stream by Lila's cabin sang the same soft song it always did. But something had changed in the air, something invisible, yet powerful. The world had bent slightly toward justice, even if only within the fences of Elias Gray's ranch. Lila began to wake with the sunrise instead of dread. Her daughters would run out into the dew-wet grass, chasing laughter instead of fear. It had been months since she arrived, but she still couldn't quite believe the life she was living. Every morning she'd step outside, barefoot, and watch the valley breathe. Golden light spilling over the hills, horses grazing, the smell of hay and new beginnings everywhere. For a woman who had once known nothing but walls and pain, freedom felt like a fragile miracle. Elias watched her from a distance. He didn't hover, didn't speak much, But he was there, always, like the steady hum of the earth beneath her feet. Sometimes he'd pass by her cabin to bring milk or tools she didn't ask for. Other times, he'd watch her daughters chase the hens and pretend not to smile when they called him Uncle Giant. To them, he wasn't the frightening figure who once filled the doorway. He was the protector who had changed the shape of their world. One afternoon, Lila stood by the stream washing clothes when Elias approached. The sky was heavy with clouds, the promise of rain thick in the air. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice low but calm. She nodded, wringing water from a shirt. "I've seen worse," she said softly. He smiled, "A rare thing." "I know you have, but now you don't have to face it alone." That night the storm came hard. Lightning tore across the sky, thunder rolled like an angry god, and rain lashed the land. The girls woke crying, frightened by the roar. Lila held them close, whispering old songs her mother had once sung to her, but the sound of the storm was too loud. Suddenly there was a knock, heavy, urgent. She opened the door to find Elias, soaked to the bone, holding lanterns and blankets. "Roof's weak," he said. "You and the girls come to the main house tonight." She hesitated, but he didn't wait for her answer. "It's not a request, Lila. The storm's meaner than it looks." Inside the ranch house, warmth glowed from the fireplace. The girls fell asleep instantly, curled on the couch beneath thick quilts. Lila stood by the fire, staring into the flames. "You shouldn't have come for us," she murmured. "You've done enough already." Elias sat in the chair opposite her, his eyes reflecting the flicker of firelight. "Doing enough is what people say when they're tired," he said. "But helping someone stand again, that's not a duty. It's a calling." The wind howled outside, but inside something softer unfolded. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full of things neither knew how to say. She looked at him, the man who had saved her without asking for anything in return. He looked back, seeing not a broken woman, but a survivor shaping herself anew. He reached for the kettle and poured her tea, his hands rough, gentle. "You know," he said, after a pause, "when I lost my wife, I stopped believing people could heal. Watching you, it's teaching me different." Lila didn't speak. Words seemed too small for what she felt. Gratitude, confusion, something that burned quietly under her ribs. For years she had been told she was worthless. Now a man looked at her and saw strength. Not beauty, not ownership. Strength. For a woman like her, that was almost too much to bear. When the storm passed, the air smelled of wet earth and dawn. The world outside sparkled, washed clean. The girls ran outside to splash in puddles while Lila and Elias stood on the porch. "They're free now," Elias said, nodding toward them. "That's because of you." Lila shook her head. "No, you gave us that chance." Elias turned to her. "I opened a door. You walked through it. Don't ever forget who did the harder thing." In the weeks that followed, Lila became more than a helper on the ranch. She became its heart. She organized the kitchen, tended to the sick animals, and earned the respect of the men who worked there. Slowly, word spread through the nearby villages about the giant rancher who had taken in a beaten woman and her daughters, about how she now ran parts of his ranch with more grace and order than any man ever had. Some mocked him for it. "The giant's gone soft," they said. "He's building his empire on pity." But Elias didn't care. "Let them talk," he'd say. "Pity doesn't raise fences or feed cattle, work does, and she works harder than any of you." But the past never dies quietly. One morning a letter arrived, torn, dirt-stained, carried by a boy from the village. Lila opened it and froze. Her husband's handwriting. "I'm coming for what's mine." That single line was enough to make her blood run cold. She went to Elias immediately, her hands trembling. "He's coming back," she whispered. "He'll burn everything." Elias read the note, then folded it carefully. "Let him come," he said. "We'll be ready." That night, the ranchers armed themselves. The girls were sent to the far barn under guard. Lila sat by the fire, her heart pounding, her mind torn between fear and fury. She had run once. Could she run again? No, not this time. Something inside her had changed. She wasn't the same woman who had begged for mercy months ago. She looked out at the dark hills and whispered to herself, "I'm not his anymore." The sound of hooves shattered the silence. Lanterns flickered in the distance, 5, maybe 6 men. Her husband hadn't come alone. They rode hard, shouting, cursing, fueled by drink and pride. Elias stood at the gate, tall and unshaken. When the first man swung down with a torch, Elias stepped forward. "Leave," he said simply. "You're not welcome here." The man laughed. "We came for the woman, the one who forgot her place." He spat into the dirt. "You think you can hide her behind your fences, old man?" Elias's eyes darkened. "She's not hiding," he said. "She's standing tall, for the first time in her life. And if you want to drag her back to hell, you'll have to go through me." The men moved closer. One raised his torch. But before Elias could step, another voice rang out. Sharp, steady. "No. They'll go through me first." It was Lila. She stepped into the light, her shawl whipping in the wind, her eyes fierce and clear. "You called me a curse," she said, her voice cutting through the night. "You beat me for giving you daughters, but those girls are my blessing, and I'll die before I let you touch them again." The men hesitated. This was not the woman they remembered. The firelight glinted off something in her hand, Elias's rifle. She didn't aim it to kill, only to protect. "Leave," she said again, calm as stone. "You've already lost everything that ever mattered." Her husband stared at her. The ghost of the woman he once controlled now standing like a storm he couldn't stop. Something in him broke. He dropped the torch, cursed under his breath, and turned away. The others followed. Within minutes the sound of hooves faded into the night. Silence fell. Not the kind born of fear, but of freedom. Elias approached her slowly. "You didn't need to do that," he said quietly. Lila lowered the rifle, her hand still shaking. "Yes, I did," she whispered. "You told me once I'd learned to stand for myself. Tonight I did." Elias nodded, pride flickering behind his calm eyes. "You did more than that, Lila. You stood for every woman who's ever been told she was less." The dawn that followed was the softest the valley had ever seen. The ranch shimmered under golden light, the air crisp and alive. Lila walked through the fields with her daughters, her heart lighter than it had ever been. She had faced the past and won, not with vengeance, but with courage. Later that morning, as she worked beside Elias by the corral, she looked up at him. "You called this place a refuge," she said. "But it's more than that now. It's home." Elias smiled faintly, looking out over the land. "Then let's make it a home for others too," he said. "For the ones who need to start again, just like you did." And that's exactly what they did. Over the months, more women arrived. Widows, mothers, daughters, each carrying their own pain, each finding new life within the fences of the ranch that became known as the Haven. Lila led them, taught them, healed them. Her daughters grew strong under her watch, fearless like the mother they had seen rise from ashes. And Elias, the giant rancher who once lived in silence, found peace not in solitude, but in purpose. Years later, when the sun set behind the same hills, Lila would often stand on the porch and watch the horizon. The wind would brush through her hair, carrying a memory, that voice from so long ago, deep and steady, saying, "Come with me." She'd smile and whisper back, "I did." And I found myself, because sometimes all it takes to change a life is not a hero, but a hand that reaches out and says, "Come with me."